Hello everybody and welcome to the first of our 3 webinars as part of the May webinar series. Today I'm joined by Kevin Harris of New Voice Media UK, and he will be presenting a webinar entitled Striving for Zero Bugs on the Test Environment. And if you have any questions for Kevin, please type them into the questions field there on your control panel. And at the very end of the webinar, we'll go to these questions one by one. And don't forget, you don't have to wait till the end of the webinar to start typing your questions. You can type them at any point. Okay, so let me now hand you over to today's presenter, Kevin. Hello, Kevin.
Hi, Dara. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. Okay, so why are we here today? Last year, EuroSTAR, I gave us a talk on my top 10 worst mistakes I'd made during agile testing. And one of the mistakes I put, the very last one, the one I put as the most important one, was the fact that as testers, the worst thing we can do is celebrate the bugs when we find them. And that seemed to raise quite a lot of discussions about the fact that I said it was a bad thing to be celebrating bugs, because that seemed to be what we as testers should be doing. But now I'm kind of focusing more on not raising bugs as opposed to raising bugs. So why is that? I guess you look at this way, I've been a tester for almost 20 years and I have raised thousands of bugs, and I mean thousands of bugs. I tried to do a quick count the other day and I think it's somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 bugs I've raised in 18 years. And I used to be really proud of that fact. I took that as validation that I was a good tester. I used to put on my CV about all the bugs I'd found on all these projects and all these companies. But here I am 20 years later, and I think I'm a much better tester than I used to be. I know more about testing, I'm more experienced, I can use more tools to help me test. Additionally, I'm now working on much more complicated systems than the ones I was testing when I first started. But now I'm raising much fewer bugs than I used to. So why is that? Why aren't I raising more bugs than I used to? So we can look at it this way. What's so wrong about raising bugs? Raising bugs is a faff and is a huge waste of time, and I'm too old and bitter to spend an hour at a time recreating bugs and filling in forms which no one wants to read. Raising bugs is an overhead. It takes a lot of time to do it. If I think about every time I find a bug on the test environment or later on and I need to raise it, then first of all I have to recreate it. I have to then try and do it in the fewest steps I can to find out what actually went wrong. I then have to try all the browsers I possibly can to see if it's a browser-specific thing. Then I've got to gather all the screenshots together. Stack traces, got to try and find those, run it through Fiddler, see what's happening in Fiddler. Then, of course, I've got to take it to the developer and show the developer, and then we'll have the discussion about whether it's a bug or a feature or if it's a different story or if it's found something I shouldn't have found or if it's an old thing or a new thing. Then I have to check the environment, see if it's actually something that's already in live or is it just in test. Then we have to prioritize it, stick it in triage, and even then you don't know whether it's going to be fixed or not. It could be hanging around in your backlog for weeks or months or years or just never be fixed. There's a huge overhead with raising bugs, but it's still seen as the thing that we are there to do. So here's the proposal. We're now at a stage where it should be possible to either prevent or find all bugs before the code actually gets to the test environment. Obviously I'm saying all bugs. We all know all bugs could be tricky, so we'll go for nearly all bugs. But there's things we can do. So today we're going to be looking at 10 different things we can do to help get the number of bugs that we raise on the test environment down, to reduce that number of bugs. Okay, number one. Number one takes place in the story kickoff or whatever variety of kickoff that you have. It doesn't actually matter if you're agile or you're still using vModel or whatever system you're using. The most important thing at the very start is to understand what the requirement is. It's all too easy in these meetings to kind of go really, really quickly into what the solution is. But it's the most important thing to know what the requirement is. You want to look at what you're doing it and why you're doing it over how you're doing it. at the start, how you're doing it is really, really unimportant. You as a team need to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. You want to know what the customer wants from you. It is the most important thing, and the thing you should do straight away at the very start before you think about anything else. So make sure you understand the requirement before anyone starts discussing a solution. Use a version of business-driven development or specification by example, or whatever variation you use to ensure that you're concentrating primarily on the requirement and not on the solution. There's different ways you can do that, and one of the ways I've done before when I was a Scrum Master that worked really well is to have two separate meetings. Meeting one, we talked about the requirement, what the customer needed, and it was forbidden in that meeting to talk about any kind of solution. The only thing we talked about was the requirement. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What does it mean for the customer? And then you can expand on that, actually look at all the edge cases around that requirement. Think about where it fits in with whatever else the customer is doing at that time. Just think about that requirement. Ask questions about the requirement. Find out all the information you need to know about that requirement at that initial stage so that the whole team are unified in knowing what you're actually going to be working on. If you can do that, then you've already cut down on the number of bugs you will raise. Any disagreements later on about what it should be doing, you shouldn't have those anymore because you'll have discussed it beforehand. You will all know what it was. Any ambiguities, the number of bugs there should be going down as well. You'll be talking about it. You will have discussed it. There shouldn't be edge cases that you hadn't talked about because you will have talked about them. So really, really do prioritize the very start of your kickoff, how you start a new piece of work, story planning, whatever you call it, concentrate on that requirement first. Okay. Step 2, also in the kickoff, small stories. I can't say how valuable having smaller stories is. So make sure that your stories are as small as you can make them, but still big enough to be worthwhile. The ideal story should have only a single moving part. So test that single moving part, and then you test the next moving part in the next story, and think about how you slice bigger stories. In the previous team, when I first joined it, we had stories, if you use Fibonacci, they were size 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and we used to kind of have a good old mix and match of those size stories. After a few months, we managed to get it down so that a 5-pointer was the biggest story we ever had. And then by the time I left that team, 3 points was the biggest story we ever had, and we had them very irregularly. We managed to keep getting the story smaller. And that really does affect how quickly and how simply you can test things. If you're testing one thing, it's really straightforward to test that one thing. You're only thinking about one thing. If you're actually trying to test 3 different things in a single story, then that makes it so much more complicated. To test it and to think about it and to think about edge cases, you've suddenly got a level of complexity that you don't need to have. A single story, a single small moving part should be all you should be looking at. If you've got these big epic stories coming through your team, think about ways you can slice it to reduce it down to as small as you can. It takes practice to do this. You can't do it straight away. And there's various resources to help you. There's whole books written on how to make smaller stories easier to develop. But it's so much better than having big stories and so much easier to test. And having stories that are easier to test will mean less bugs for you. Less complexity, more straightforward. And for the development side as well, it's easier to code if you're just coding one thing and not trying to code 4 things at the same time. So try and get the stories down. If people are telling you that a story has to have a business impact to make it a story you can develop, disagree with them. If you have one piece that's quite a medium-sized story, and you're looking at that, and people are saying, well, that's the smallest bit that actually has a business impact. What if it's easy to break it down to 3 stories? If they don't have business impact for themselves, the first 2 stories, and the third one does, then just do it as 3 stories. You don't have to make sure that each of those stories has a business impact, because they are all adding up to that third story where you're giving the business impact, the business what it requires. But you've made it easier to develop, and you've made it easier to test as you get to that stage. So don't worry about whether a story in itself has business impact. As long as it's deliverable and testable and deployable, then go for that. Go for the small stories. It really, really does help. Okay, slide 3. You'll see this is also in the kickoff. Ask, ask, and ask again. So go into your kickoff meeting, your story planning, whatever variation. Oh, you're kidding. I've lost you. Excuse me, if you can hear me at a second, I'm now getting a ringing tone.
We can still see your screen there, Kevin.
Oh, I had something buzzing in my ear. Is that me or you, Dar? Do you know?
I'm not sure. Might be gone again now. But if you open up your slides there again, I think the platform is still running. It may have just had a glitch. It's a good thing we have a lot of software testers on hand here.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. I had a dial tone going in my ear for a couple of seconds, and I thought I'd lost you all. Okay, ask questions in that kickoff. That is your job in the kickoff, the story planning. Go in, ask questions. First of all, be prepared. Know what you're going to be talking about. Read up on it beforehand. Make sure you've got a reasonable idea of what the requirement is before you go in. Know what questions you need to ask. Know what the things are that you're not aware of, the things you haven't found out the answers to. So go in with your questions and ask the questions in the kickoff. Don't be afraid to speak up to ask about things you don't know about. And keep asking until you have all the information that you need. It's better for you to ask the questions here than to wait later. Don't think, well, I'll ask these questions afterwards, because if you've got questions, then other people on the team will have questions as well. So ask the questions now, don't wait. And also, don't worry if your question seems to be a stupid question. There are no stupid questions at this point. The worst thing you can do is ask the question later, or don't ask it at all, and then find out later on it is an issue.
Hi, Kevin. Sorry for interrupting there. You seem to have disappeared there for a moment. Can you hear me loud and clear? We apologize there, everybody. I think there's just a small issue with the Kevin's audio there. We'll get it sorted very quickly, and we'll continue on then with the webinar.
Can you hear me now, Dara?
Yes, we're back again.
There we go. We're back in the room. I do apologize, everybody. This is why we get into software testing, the ability to break things without trying. Okay, so you need to be asking the questions in your kickoff meetings. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Any questions you want, anything you don't know, you need to ask the questions in that meeting. You can't sit there and ask the questions later. You have to ask them at that time. So don't be a wallflower. Ask your questions. Okay, secondly, in the kickoff, don't just ask questions, but tell the other members of your team what you're going to be doing, how you're going to test, what you're going to test, how you're going to test it. All these things you need to be telling the rest of your team. You do not want to be surprising them later on with things that you hadn't told them later. If you get a bug on the system and the developer turns to you and say, I didn't know you were going to test that, that was your responsibility to tell the developer what you were going to do. There shouldn't be any surprises when you're testing. There shouldn't be anything that you're testing that they are not aware of. So in the kickoff, say what you're going to be doing. Say how you're going to be testing it. List the tools you're going to use. Tell them why you're using those tools. Tell them if they're security tools you're going to be using. You're going to be looking for any kind of SQL injection. Then they will code against that. They will know these are things you need to be testing against, so those are things they need to be coding against. And that will make sure the code is cleaner when it gets to you. Look at the areas you need to regression test, and that should be a discussion. You'll know from your point of view the areas you think the customer will be affected, but the developers will know what parts of the code will be affected as well, and that might have knock-on effects that you're not aware of. So you need to talk about these things in this kickoff meeting. You must not keep information back for when you start testing. Don't have surprise tests to see whether the developer was paying attention. You can't do that anymore. You can't keep tests back and say, aha, I found this and you never even looked in that area. That's not your job anymore. Your job is to tell them what areas you're going to be testing. There should be no surprises. There should be no, I didn't know you were going to test that discussions. You will have told about it first. There will not be any surprises. Okay. Next, and you'll see we are still in that kickoff meeting. We have not left the kickoff meeting yet. Last thing to talk about in the kickoff meeting is the test automation. You need to talk about, at a high level, what automated tests are going in and at what level those tests are going to be. You will have your acceptance criteria, and hopefully those acceptance criteria are all going to be automated in some way. It doesn't matter what level they are. It might be that the best place to have them is at the unit test level, or it might be that you need an end-to-end test to test some of this stuff. But you want it automated. You don't want it left to a manual regression test later. You want automated tests in, and you need to know which tests they are, what level they are, and how they work. So once you've started, review them, and review them often. Go sit with your developer, get him to show you his tests. See them running. It's really important and it's really useful. It's surprising how many times, even if you don't understand the code behind it, when you see it run, you can suggest new tests. And also it helps with the negative testing side as well. You can suggest negative tests to put in to make sure they're covered too. Test automation, the way we work now, is really vitally important. We can't have enough of it compared to manual regression testing. The worst testing you have to do in the world at the moment is manual regression testing. Having to do the same tests every week, hoping for the same outcome. They're not fun. So get as much of it automated as you can. Check it, make sure it's automating the bits you want it to, and then you don't have to worry about it so much. Right, so that's halfway through. That's halfway through my 10 pieces of information and advice, and we haven't got out that first meeting yet. And that kind of tells you how important that first meeting is. You need to be using that kickoff meeting, that story planning, that script review, that spec review. Whatever you're doing, you need to be using the initial meeting to talk about everything else that's going to happen in that dev cycle. It is so important. We're at the stage now where communication is the #1 player in how we work. So you have to communicate. You have to get all of these things sorted and talked about and discussed. And if you've done that, every one of these will help prevent bugs. You will not find any more bugs from these, but these will prevent bugs at every step of the way from now on. Okay. So what happens when we get past the kickoff? It goes to development. Now, in the old days, of course, that's when we'd all go and get a cup of tea and sit and wait and wait and wait, and then wait some more, and then at some point we'd suddenly be told that it's now on the test environment. But we don't work like that anymore. We don't have to work like that anymore. So it's in developers. Go see the developers. Hopefully you're co-located. If you're not, that doesn't matter. There's many ways of communicating now. But check in with the developers at least every day. Some teams I've worked with have worked really well when the tester and the developer have paired up. And for some stories, that's actually the most powerful way you can do it. Pair up with the developer while they are actually developing. And then when you come to testing, they can pair with you. But then you see what's going on. So even if you can't do that, get demos whenever there's something worth demoing. Get a demonstration of how it's working. Each little thing doesn't have to be the whole story. It could be just one part of the page, one part of the chain, one part of the process. But get a demo, because if you see the demo and it's not right or it's not what you expect, then you get to have that conversation while it's still on the developer machine. Don't just have those demos for yourself. If you've got product owners, get the product owner involved then as well. Get them to have that demo, because the best thing for them is if it's not what they want, they see it now in development and they don't have to wait until it's in pre-production to say, actually, that's not what I wanted. So any problems with the requirements, you're finding them much, much earlier. It's in the code, but it's not anywhere in a test environment. It's really, really quick. And it's so important to try and do this. Next, test on the dev machine. Don't wait for it to get to the test environment. You don't need to do that. So pair with the developer. If he's got bits that are demoable, then they're testable. It won't be the full scope of the entire story, the entire piece of work, but you can sit with them, either go through it on their machine with them next to you, or they can go get a cup of tea and you can just play with it for 10 minutes, explore it for 10 minutes, run some of your tests. It's so powerful to be able to do that this early on. So don't lose that opportunity. One of the other things that we've been trying recently is to get access to the developer's VM and test on that while they're actually doing the coding. And that doesn't matter then whether you're co-located. I work at the moment with a team where 3 of the developers are in the UK and 2 of them are in Poland. And it's just as easy for me to test on one of the Polish developers' machines as it is to the UK developers' machines. So I've got their VM address, I dial in, remote in, and I can test on their VM while they're doing the code. And this is really, really powerful to be able to do this. We found out that basically they'll be there doing their code. I'll dial in and I'll find things that are wrong. Little things, big things, it doesn't matter. And I can just list them off, stick them in an email, put them in some chat, put them on a piece of paper and pass across the desk. As they're in that area, then it's really easy for them to change it quickly. And developers are actually much happier for you to do that than if you wait longer. If I think back for when I was in the first Agile team about 10 years ago, even then, you would first be testing it on the test environment, and you'd raise a bug, and they'd go away, and you'd have to recreate it, and they'd show you, and you'd show them how it worked or didn't work, and then they'd go away, and they'd fix it, and then the next day you get the new code, and you'd retest it, and you'd say whether it was okay or not. So you had like a one-day gap between you finding something to you getting that first fix back. Doing it this way, you don't have to wait a day. I've had fixes within a minute this way for simple UI changes, spelling mistakes, anything you find. They're so pleased you found it now and they're quite happy to then fix it. So I've had put lists across and had them ticked off one by one, so that when I actually do see the same screen on the test environment, all the things I found have already been fixed. All the things in the old days we'd have to wait and raise a bug for on the test environment, I'm not having to raise any bugs anymore because everything is fixed before it gets anywhere near the test environment. We talked at the very start about the fact that some bugs aren't going to be fixed. The small things don't get fixed. If you've got deadlines and there's a couple of spelling mistakes or things are not quite lined up on the page, those bugs are going to get to the bottom of the list and not be fixed. If you do it this way, then they get fixed. It's just a list of things that the developer can look at while they are actually in the code, while they are developing that screen or that process. And they just fix them as they go along with all the rest of their work. So the little things get fixed. And that is really nice as a tester, when you can see the finished article and the quality is good. Because in the old days, we used to be happy with it, but we used to see these little things on the screen that we knew were errors, we knew there were bugs there that was going to sit in the backlog for weeks and weeks. And now we don't get that. We get a better quality end product because we are fixing everything much sooner. So try that. It's really powerful. I've had people think that you can't do that if you're deploying quickly or depending on what kind of development you do, but you can. It's really quick. You're on the VM, they're writing some code, they ask you to pause for a minute, they upload the new code, you're back on the VM with the fixes. It's so quick, so powerful. So do try that. It really, really does work well. Okay, step 8. So the handover. So I guess in the old days we used to call this the bit where the code was thrown over the wall. But we don't have that kind of environment anymore. It's not a handover anymore. We're not handing things from one team to another. There is no them and us with the way we work anymore. It's just us. So when you're actually getting the stage where the code from the dev machine is going to go to the test environment, it should be so much smoother. So get a final demo on the developer's machine. Go through it all again. Go through the areas of risk. If he's been in this area for a few days, he'll know the bits he's happy about and the bits he's not happy about. If there's areas of risk there, he'll let you know, and you can look at them there and then, or you can go away and put them to one side and actually do a session on those when you get it onto your test environment. Go through the acceptance criteria one last time. It's so easy to forget when you're deep into a story what you're actually meant to be doing. So ensure at this point that you're reviewing all of the acceptance criteria again. See them working on the developer's machine. See the automated tests working on the developer's machine. The good thing is that if you've done everything else by this point, there aren't any surprises here. There are no shocks. It's not the first time you've seen the code, the first time you've seen it working. You've seen it working all the way through. There are no shocks here. It shouldn't be a surprise. There shouldn't be anything you're not expecting. So sit with them, take as long as you need, maybe do one last long test on the developer's machine. Also, of course, get the product owner involved at this point. Show them how it's working. Get them involved. Let them see it before it gets any further. If they're the person signing it off, you want them to know what's there. Again, you don't want them to be shocked, surprised when it gets to further environments that they then will need to look at. So spend some time on this bit. Ensure you're happy, ensure the developer's happy, ensure the product owner is happy as well. This one could be quite controversial. Everybody tests. One of the problems we've had in the past has been when you get to the test environment, and if you're using Kanban board like we do, it kind of moves across and then suddenly it gets stuck and you get this bottleneck in the test environment. You've got more developers than testers, things suddenly flow through quickly, or things have gone back and suddenly there's a lot of things that need testing all at the same time. So what we've done now is that basically every developer and every tester in our team can test a story. This took probably a fair few months to kind of get this up and going. And you're going to be thinking, well, no, I don't want the developers testing. And at the start, you need to handhold. You need to sit with them. You could start off with you and a developer testing a story. And then they get to, well, the good thing is that they get to see how you work, how you test a story, how you think about it. And they start to try and think that way as well. They're starting to look at this code with their testing hat on. We do it so that a developer doesn't test their own stories. They'll only test stories that they haven't been involved in. Because you can't really test your own stuff. I did development for a couple of years, and the worst thing for me was when other people found obvious bugs on my code. And you kind of think, I'm a really good tester, how did I miss these things? But if you're developing, you don't see it. Other people see things that you will not see. So you need to make sure that these are people who haven't done the code themselves. So pair up with them, show them how to test. You can do things like create wiki pages with information on. So if you have something that's something you test in the same way in different areas, you can create a wiki page just outlining what kind of testing you would expect to do in those areas. And then the developers can follow that. So teach them various testing techniques. So we use quite a lot of exploratory testing here. So one of the things we do is we'll let the developers test the stories. They will now create their own exploratory testing sessions, and then we'll review those sessions afterwards, and we'll suggest things to do. But one of the things we've noticed is that the amount of feedback that we give on those sessions has reduced over the months because the developers are getting very good at doing testing. So it's not all the time, it's just when we get to that stage where we used to have bottlenecks. Now we don't have bottlenecks anymore. Now everybody can test. There are some things that are more suitable. We have some technical stories that come through, and those the developers are more likely to be testing than the non-technical stories. But any story is available for anybody in the team to test it if that is required. And that's worked really well. And that means that as they are thinking about testing, when they go back to do some more development, they will have a little bit of that testing hat on as well. They will be thinking about the things that they didn't used to think about, the areas that you test that they wouldn't necessarily consider when doing the coding. And they will now consider them more, and they will create code that has less of the issues that they used to. And that's really powerful as well, knowing that the developers are thinking about the testing as they're going along. You might be thinking that developers are going to have issues with that, and as testers you might have an issue with that as well, but it really does work. You have to take it slowly. There's no quick fix on that, but it's quite amazing what can happen when you try that for a little bit. And now in our team, there's never any issue about a developer picking up a story and testing it. It's kind of second nature. And that really, really does work well. While you're there, of course, when you had that handover, get the developers to talk you through how they tested their code as well. So the code they wrote and then the code they tested. Get them to talk that through as well. And you'll learn things about how they look at it, and they'll learn things about how you look at it as well. It is really important, and I really suggest you have a try at that, especially if you're one of those teams that have a test bottleneck. We don't have a bottleneck anymore because everybody can test. Okay, this is the last one. What do you do when you find a bug? First of all, do not celebrate finding bugs. It's the easiest thing to do, to look at the code and think, yes, I found a bug. I found it. I've validated my existence. But step back, think about that. You're celebrating some error in the process. Something has gone wrong somewhere. And you're celebrating a failure in your team is what you're celebrating. You shouldn't be celebrating finding bugs. If you've got to the stage where you're not finding many bugs on the test environment, then look why these bugs get through. Look why they're there. What did you miss? How could you have prevented this? Could you have prevented this? Why couldn't you find it earlier? Why couldn't you find it on the developer's machine? Was it a problem with the specification right at the very start? And if so, why was that there? Was there ambiguity? Did you not talk about it enough? If you're not creating many bugs anymore, then maybe you want to do a 5 whys on it. Really look at every bug that you raise and think, why am I raising this bug? What went wrong? It's kind of opposite of the way we used to feel about bugs, where we used to think, right, I'm a tester, I find bugs. I saw on Test Huddle the other day, and one of the questions was things you should never say to a tester, and the thing that somebody wrote in was when people tell them they're finding too many bugs. And I think we have to think about that again. Are we finding too many bugs? If somebody says to you, you're finding too many bugs, is that right? Is there a failure in your process? Why are you finding so many bugs? Are you not talking about them earlier? Are you not testing earlier? Are you not talking to your developers earlier? Have a look at the bugs you are raising and think, can I prevent those earlier? Because that's where we are now. We're not at a testers find bugs phase. We're at the team prevents bug phase. So look at the bugs you're raising. Think about why you're raising so many. Try and analyze all those bugs and think, can I have actually prevented those getting here? Can I have reviewed the specs better? Can I have spoken up in that first kickoff meeting? Why didn't they know I was going to test the security on this story? All those conversations you should have earlier that might end up meaning you are creating less bugs. So if somebody says you're creating too many bugs, they're probably saying it for the wrong reasons, but think about it anyway. Analyze those bugs you're raising and have a think about it. Okay, so the benefits of all of these things we've been talking about. First of all, you get cleaner code. It's less bugs on it. You don't have a backlog of bugs like you used to. You have more things fixed. You get more things right the first time. You don't have to put up with things that are kind of, well, it almost works and it's too late to go and fix it, so we'll just leave it as it is. You get better quality code at the end. Quicker cycle time as well. The worst thing with a story is when it just bounces backwards and forwards between dev and test. They put it into test, you check it, you find some bugs, you send it back, and you play ping pong with these stories. And they're the worst stories in the world. After a couple of weeks, you're just fed up and you just want to move on. So if there's smaller stories, well tested earlier, with that communication, they don't bounce back as much, nowhere near as much. So it's much quicker. If it's much quicker, then obviously you get the functionality sooner. You have something working much sooner than you used to. And if that's all happening, then it's cheaper. Less development time, and that's all from just putting that time in earlier. And if you are getting to the stage where you have very few bugs on your test environment and you're not raising hardly anything, and then you're testing it and you're moving it to the pre-production environment, you could be thinking, actually, do I really need that extra environment anymore? If I've done all of my testing before it even gets to test, do I need the test environment? Is that just one step that we could think about doing away with? That might be a hurdle to think about in the future, but it could happen. So what could go wrong? A couple of things can go wrong. First of all, deployment errors. One thing about a developer's machine is that it's the developer's machine. It's not a live-like environment. So first of all, you have to deploy to another environment to make sure that the deployment process works. And you will only do that from moving it from development to test or a version thereof. So deployment issues, you'll still get them. Secondly, of course, environmental issues. It's not a live environment. It's not even a test environment. It's a developer's machine. So any problems that are environmental, you're not as likely to pick them up as you are that are functional. And it will require change in behavior for some people. If you're still thinking about it as a developer team and a test team, and the developers are thinking that way as well, it's going to be harder to then kind of get it as this fully functioning, fully communicating team. It is possible, though. It can be done. I've worked with some teams that you kind of go in and you think this is never going to happen, but if you give it time and you take it the right way, then it does happen. I think the most salient point is to think about developers, and the worst thing for a developer is not talking to a tester. It's when a tester finds a bug and raises a bug against their code. So if you're finding ways to prevent that from happening, then the developers will see the benefit of that as well, and will be happy to kind of run with some of these processes that before you might thought they wouldn't ever want to do. So do think about that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 1 month change to get some of these things. It can take 6 months sometimes, but it's worth trying. Because a lot of these things really do work, and they are really, really powerful. So that's it for me. That's 10 ways that you can help prevent bugs from getting to your test environment or finding them earlier. I think we all know we're not going to get to the stage where we have 0 bugs on the test environment, but it's certainly the stage now where we should be really looking at all the bugs that are there and thinking, do they need to be on the test environment, or could I have found them or prevented them earlier? So please do try some of these if you haven't used them before. I've used all of them now in various teams, and they've all been beneficial. Okay, I'm now going to hand back to Dara, who I hope has a couple of questions for me, not just about how bad my microphone is.
Thank you very much for that, Kevin. That was great. Some great points you made there. And let me just open up my screen here again. Okay, so we have 2 more webinars as well taking place this week. We have a webinar on tomorrow with Jeff Thompson. He will be talking to you about test improvement. And on Thursday, we have a webinar with Hans Buwalda, where he will talk to you about test automation. And you can register for these 2 webinars over on Test Huddle. And also, I just want to bring to your attention as well that we have a 15% discount on the cost of your ticket if you register for the EuroSTAR conference before the 31st of May. So there's still a little bit of time left there to avail of these discounts. And if you head over to the EuroSTAR conference site, you can check out the program and everything we've lined up for you. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the questions that have come through here for you, Kevin. And I have a question here, and it's asking, if you're not a QA or test lead, how can you influence the earlier approach?
Well, there's various ways you can do that, and they can be subtle ways or they can be more blatant ways. But asking questions earlier on is not something that just a QA lead should be doing. It should be anybody in the team should be doing that. So in the kickoff, doesn't matter what your role is, you should be asking questions. So don't be afraid of asking questions, because you should be doing that early. You should be having that communication. So there are process improvements you can do just for yourself. So even if you are just a tester on a team, you can still go and talk to the developers while they're developing and say, can I just sit with you and see what you're doing? Have you got something to demo to me at the moment? You don't have to be a QA lead or a test manager to do this. You can spend that time and just do it off your own initiative to doing that, and you will see the benefits then as well.
Okay, let's take a look at another question here. And this attendee is asking, do you find any resistance from testers with this approach? I'd imagine some of them thought it's harder to demonstrate to my manager my individual value to the team by preventing issues rather than logging issues.
I know it's a tricky one. It's kind of a whole change in the way we look at how we work and how we measure it, isn't it? As I was saying at the start, it's kind of a tester is seen by how many bugs they raise. But then again, we've seen when that doesn't work, where if you're measured on how many bugs you raise, then you raise bugs for every full stop that's missing on a page. It's a hard one to kind of get over that leap, but if you're getting to the stage where the things you are working on get through quicker with less bugs in them, and you're not still finding bugs on the live environment of things, if your code is cleaner and it's getting through quicker, then people will see the benefit of it. So you have to go for it. You have to do that leap of faith to kind of start off thinking, right, now I'm not going to be a bug raiser, I'm going to be a bug preventer.
This attendee is asking, what about teams where development happens in one team and functional acceptance happens in another team?
That is a tricky one. Some of the things you're not going to be able to do, some of the things you can do, and some of the things you're going to be trying to influence other people on to enable you to do these things. Even if you've got different teams, obviously when the developers first get their requirements to start looking at that, can you get into that meeting? Can you get into that meeting where they start talking about what work they're going to be doing? Are they working from a specification? If they are, can you get that specification first? Because if you can do that, even if you've just got a piece of paper saying what the work's going to be, you can feed back on that. You should be reading that through, finding the questions you want to ask, and then firing those questions back to whoever's written the specification. So ask to see the specifications, the requirements before they actually get to development, and influence it that way. So try that as a kind of a first step.
Another question here is asking, would it be a good idea if testers help developers come up with more automated tests?
Yes.
Short and sweet.
It's one of the reasons why I like to sit with the developers and see the tests running. And a lot of the time, I'll be able to suggest other tests, and then they'll go and add them in. So it really is that should be part of your role. Even though the developers are writing the automated tests, you can be suggesting the automated tests. So please do so. Please try that.
Okay, I have another question here. It's kind of long, so if you need me to repeat it,
okay.
I will indeed. And it's referring to step 7, test on the dev machine. How do you manage reporting issues for things that the developer has not yet done? For example, if the developer is in the middle of working on a feature that might be stuff that doesn't work when you look at it, but the developer already knows it doesn't work because he hasn't implemented it yet.
Okay. That's fine. It's a conversation. If you're unsure whether it's something that should be working yet, then you just talk to the developer and say, I've seen this, are you aware of that? And they'll come back and say, yep, that's fine, it's something I know I have to do in the future. Or also what you can do is you have the conversation beforehand and say, okay, I know you haven't finished this yet, but what's in scope? What bits should I be testing? Which bits do we know don't work yet? So have the conversation either before or when you find something. and it's a really quick conversation. It's 10 seconds of saying, what about this? And they'll say, yep, that's fine. That's the next bit I'm going to do. So have the conversation, and it's no issue at all.
Okay, and this attendee is asking, how do you manage resource if a dev and a QA are working on the same piece of work in parallel?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question on that one. The way we work, we have work on our Kanban board, so there's nobody specifically assigned to a piece of work in the future. So it doesn't matter who as a tester will look at something that a developer is developing for us. I know that some people use a kind of a three amigos approach, but I kind of think that's the minimum you should have. If everybody on the team knows what the piece of work is and how it works, then anybody can develop it, anybody can code review it, and anybody can test it. So we don't have those kind of resource issues because you just get involved when you need to on a piece of work.
The next question is asking, is it only a bug if you find it in test environment and report it? All those small things you find early and get fixed within minutes, aren't those bugs too, just found earlier?
Yes, they are, but they're not something you're going to have to spend the time raising. A bug is something I'll only raise if it's on the test environment. So we obviously have bug tracking tools here that we use, but I won't go anywhere near that if I find it earlier than the test environment. So if I find it on the dev environment, it's the conversation, it's the piece of paper, it's the line in the chat saying what's wrong. So they're bugs, but they're bugs that are within the sphere of the developer's space. So I don't raise them. I don't need to raise them. I'll only raise them if it's on the test environment.
Another question here is just simply asking, this might sound very overly simplistic, but isn't finding issues one of the more satisfying parts of a tester's role?
It is, and I still do get enjoyment when I find a bug that I couldn't ever have thought about finding before I'd actually got into the code. Sometimes the exploratory testing is when you first kind of have an idea about things you want to look at. It's a question of getting the enjoyment in other ways as well. So you'll get enjoyment knowing that a code has just flown through and you've hardly had to look at it because it's been so clean and so nice. Or from finding things and pointing them out so much earlier that when you actually get on the test environment, you know that you've raised it already and it's been fixed, and you look at it and think, right, that's a good bit of code because I tested it earlier. I'm seeing really, really clean work that I don't have to raise bugs on because of my input into that process.
How do you make this happen as a tester without a lot of manager buy-in? How do you help the change in behavior happen?
You have to do it a little bit on your own initiative. I don't think people, even your test managers, are going to be annoyed with you for asking questions earlier or asking to see things earlier. That's got to be seen. I've been a test manager myself. If somebody's showing that level of initiative, I'm going to be quite happy with that. If you're having those conversations before you need to and you're showing initiative that other people maybe are not within your team or within your test community, it's a good thing. If you're finding bugs earlier, if you can show, look, I found these things on the development environment, which meant they didn't get into tests, then that's a good thing. You've got something to then go back and say, this is why I'm doing that. But even small conversations, small inputs at various levels can really help you with these things. So do try and have those conversations. Try and sit with the developer just for 5 minutes and just say, can you just give me a quick demo of what you're doing?
Okay, I have another question here, and this attendee is asking, how do you manage the higher volume of smaller stories so that nothing was missed?
Well, the good thing about small stories is they're not there for very long. You get a very quick turnaround on small stories. they will be on your board for only 4 or 5 days, and then they're off, and then you've forgotten about them again. It's much easier to have it that way than actually have one story that's been on your board for 30 days because it's so big and gnarly that you're always looking for new things. If you can really clarify it into small bits of work, then they just flow through, and as soon as they're through, you forget about them, you move on to the next bit. So it does actually work quite nicely when they are really flowing. It does take a bit of practice, but if you can get them really flowing, it really does quicken the process, and you don't worry too much about this because you are only testing one thing at a time.
Okay, this attendee here is just referring to one of your earlier slides, and that you were talking about the to reduce stories to move in one part, and they would like you to just kind of expand a bit more on what you meant by the moving part.
Okay, so if you've got a screen that has kind of 3 different input fields, and each of those input fields does a separate piece of work, goes off to a separate API or has a separate validation behind it, you might actually think that if you can separate those into 3 separate things as opposed to doing the screen in one go, you're going to just take each moving part, so each of the things that has an individual life of its own, and just test that, then that's a very clean way of working. You're not worried about 3 different things all banging against each other, and you do A and B, then you don't know what's going to happen to C. If you're just doing A or A to B and not worrying about C, it seems a much nicer way of working for me.
All right, well, we're almost out of time here, so we'll take one more question if that's okay. Let me just look through here. I'll grab something. This person here is asking, does every feature have its own branch, and when do you merge the master into your branch, or the other way around?
Oh, that's possibly the best question, and I'll probably have more than a minute to speak about that one. Actually, we have no branches at all. We are purely trunk here. We have no branching, and the way we do that is by toggling as much of the work as we can. So all new feature work that we do is behind a toggle, and it's up to us then when we turn those toggles on or off. So the code, it doesn't matter how far through a story you are, when you put the code in or when we go live with the release of that code, because everything is behind a toggle. So we don't branch at all, we only have trunk, and then it's up to us when we turn the toggles on and off, and that we can do that when we're happy to, and we have them in a way that we can actually do it in the middle of a normal working day or in the middle of the night. We don't have to wait for a release to do that. We'll have yes, no toggles, we'll take the toggle, that works then live. So we toggle everything so we have no branching. Okay.
All right, we're out of time here, unfortunately, and there's a lot of information there, but you'll be glad to know that we're recording this webinar, so this will be available to view over on Test Huddle very shortly. I just want to thank Kevin for taking time out today for this presentation, and I'd also like to thank all of you guys for coming along, and we hope to see you at the other webinars that we have taking place this week. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Dar.